All right, Danny Funt has a new book out, Everybody Loses: The Tumultuous Rise of American Sports Gambling, that explores the rapid expansion of legalized sports betting in the United States and its wide-ranging impact on leagues, athletes, and fans. If you listen to this show, you know that Jeff and I talk about it all the time. So, Danny, congrats on the new book. Thanks for joining us to talk about it on the show.
Hey, good to be with you.
All right. So tell us, I mean, we're in Jersey, so I am a little familiar with the Supreme Court situation of how we got here, but how did 2018 and the Supreme Court's decision to overturn what was shape the trajectory of how this all went?
I spoke about this with Governor Chris Christie, who, of course, was running your state when they fought to bring their case to the Supreme Court and ultimately open the floodgates for bookmaking across the country. And he joked that there should be a statue of him outside MetLife Stadium just
I'm
because of how
shocked.
influential he was. Yeah. Uh, let's be honest, he kind of saw where things were moving and got on board, but there was a lot of forces that led to all this. One of them, interestingly, that I cover in my book was the sort of narrative came to be that the legalization movement was an effort to drive out all these black market operators that were taking tens of billions of dollars in bets from Americans illegally before all this exploded. And what I found out was actually they were working with people in New Jersey to initiate the legalization movement, that they were kind of stuck, them and their money, in Costa Rica and Panama and these other places where these offshore sites are based. And they wanted to be legitimized in the US. And then things took off and everyone tried to get their piece of the pie and they were shut out. But that was one of the main things I wanted to get to the bottom of in my book was how did this all start? Because as you know, the leagues were so adamantly opposed to the spread of gambling outside Nevada, calling it an evil and the deadliest possible thing that could happen to sports, something Bud Selig said barely a decade ago. So to see how they did a complete 180 on that was kind of head spinning, and I'm glad to be able to get some answers.
So the black market organizations didn't go away; they just became legitimized.
Well, not really, because, yeah, you're right. They didn't go away. And
Mm.
that really undermines one of the cases for legalization, which was this is going to drive out the black market. People I respect estimate that about $50 billion continues to be wagered illegally every year. So, by no means are street bookies or these offshore sites out of business. In some respects, legalization almost helps them because it makes people more aware of gambling and more interested in placing a bet. And then they realize you can bet with higher limits offshore, you can get better prices. You can bet anonymously, you can bet with crypto. There's a lot of reasons why certain people are drawn to the black market. But there's no mistake that this other argument that all that was going to happen was you were going to convert illegal bettors into legal ones so that their wagering could be taxed. That's not the reality. The pool of people growing is dramatically bigger than ever. And I find it kind of astonishing that the leagues and the sports books continue to argue that there's somehow no more betting now than there ever was pre 2018.
How important and detrimental was it for owners of sports teams to get involved in this legalized betting?
It really can't be understated. And nowadays, as we've seen sort of the fallout, both in gambling corrupting sports and the public health consequences, some of these owners and commissioners have tried to downplay their involvement. I remember recently Rob Manfred, the commissioner of Major League Baseball, this was as they were about to ink a $300 million deal with Polymarket, one of these top prediction market platforms. And Manfred said the exact word used was, "We were dragged into sports betting, and now we're being dragged into prediction markets." The exact opposite is true. Baseball, the NBA, the NHL, even the NFL eventually were extremely hands-on in persuading one state after another to legalize, in persuading their media partners to embrace this and make it a big part of how they cover sports. And so the idea that like they had no say in the matter or the train was leaving the station with or without them is just historically false. And I even heard from the people who they were working with, the lobbyists, um, other people across the country saying, yeah, without the enthusiasm of the leagues, there's no way things would have taken off to the extent they did.
Which is ironic because I remember interviewing Bud Selig years ago, and it was around the time that they were talking about Pete Rose going into the Hall of Fame, and everything like that. And you have to ask the gambling question and his adamant opposition to it, and then Manfred saying they're dragged along when in reality they're all being propped up as much as they're being dragged along. Of anything, your title, everybody loses, wasn't a title you had before the book when you went in, actually. You said it was a realization of talking to hundreds of people, mainly in the industry, and seeing how they think about their customers, how they think about their business. Can you talk more about that at a structural level?
Yeah, and one of the ideas I was trying to convey with that title is yes, Americans are losing a staggering amount of money as they bet more than $150 billion every year. But the idea that I was sort of trying to get at with everybody loses is there's a lot more than money at stake. People are losing trust in the integrity of games, in the independence of sports media, in the credibility of journalists who they trust to give it to them straight. From a health standpoint, the losses are terrifying. Both, people who become addicted or who just develop a problematic relationship with gambling that costs them a lot of money and a lot of mental well-being and all sorts of things and does damage to their family and friends. So the scale of that losing is pretty hard to wrap your head around. And you asked about, part of what led to that title and that conclusion was getting to speak with so many people in the business. Part of that was hearing them say how hard it actually is for sports books to make money, which might come as a surprise. It did to me because we all know the house always wins. We all think this is one of the most slam dunk businesses imaginable. And yet, something like 60 operators flooded the marketplace initially. And it really seems like it's going to be a duopoly with FanDuel and DraftKings controlling the lion's share of the market and a few other operators kind of treading water. And that, the idea that even the operators are losing was eye-opening. And then again, to this idea of losing being bigger than money, hearing people who work in the business say they have reservations and concerns about how customers are treated, how they're sometimes taken advantage of. There was an executive at a sports book who has left that role, but he said, when you think about it, my job was basically to slowly bleed people dry. And he said, if you're lucky enough to be an exec at one of these companies, you can make good money, but you don't feel good about it. That's for sure. I heard things like that again and again, basically giving the impression that they know what they're doing verges on predatory behavior and that they're kind of in awe and concerned that these companies are allowed to get away with that.
The sad thing to me is not only the predatory behavior towards fans, it's also towards the athletes.
Yeah, I begin my book with that, partly because it's terrifying and where that's headed could be a real tragedy. You've got all sorts of athletes, not just superstars who are under the spotlight, but Division two basketball players, bench players in pro sports, you name it. If you're in sports and people are betting on you, it sounds like you're being hounded by angry gamblers constantly. And you might say, well, they make a lot of money. That comes with the territory. I don't think anyone would accept the reality that because of so many people betting and how crazed people can get when they lose money, especially through a bad beat, you've got people like JB Bickerstaff, the head coach of the Pistons, saying people have texted him that they know the identities of his children and where he lives, basically threatening them because the Pistons, or I guess at the time the Cavs, when he was the coach of the Cavs, had cost them money. You've got Mike Schilt, the former manager of the San Diego Padres, saying he resigned this past season in part because he was so exhausted from getting so many death threats from gamblers. You've had people arrested for the most graphic death threats you could think of, saying, I've lost everything. I have nothing to live for. I'm going to destroy you and your family. And you've got the former chief security officer of the NFL who told me, based on all this and what he was seeing from the inside, As he put it, it's only a matter of time before some deranged gambler tries to kill an athlete who costs them money. And who knows what people will do if it comes to that. But as I said, I began the book with this because it's such a clear example of the fact that way more people are betting than ever. Like at the NCAA, there was a guy who's in charge of gambling policy who said this sort of harassment was like a flickering flame pre 2018 before that Supreme Court decision. Since then, it's like a wildfire burning out of control.
Okay, so then the question is why aren't they doing anything, or what are they doing in order to tamp this down before it gets to that point? If it always amazes me because sports leagues seem always to be reactive instead of proactive. Here's a chance to be proactive. What are they doing, if anything?
They're counting the cash.
No doubt. They're so entangled in the business of gambling, down to investing in companies and in vendors that sort of are the infrastructure of online sports gambling. So what they do when there's a scandal or threats that players are complaining about, they'll offer changes on the margins. Like they'll say, we're going to put limits on how much you can bet on balls or strikes after two pitchers on the Cleveland Guardians were arrested for fixing individual pitches. Okay, but you could place a lot of bets across multiple operators and still get down a lot of money. Or the NFL said, we've sent a memo to all the teams that says we don't allow bets on things like officiating decisions, like how many penalties there will be, or whether there will be an incomplete pass on the first play of a game, because it would be so easy to fix that stuff. And that sounded like action. And then you realize, no, they've had that rule in place for years. So they were just kind of rehashing what's already been the status quo. The real change, and I sometimes balk at like, waving my arm about this is what the policy changes should be, because it's just not how I think about things as a reporter. But what you're seeing is some states say we should ban player props. The idea that A, it puts them under such a microscope, and B, it would be so easy for them to fix a game if it or fix their own play, like how many points they'll get, how many rebounds, whatever. That's inappropriate. It's also potentially a path to compulsive betting if you're betting on thousands of opportunities within a game as opposed to just who's going to win or lose. So recently, you've seen Colorado, Ohio, I believe, some other states go there. And then it's even more politically palatable to ban player props for college sports. And more states have done that. And the NCAA actually has encouraged that. But the professional leagues, they're not coming close to going that far.
I'm curious about the gaming versus gambling angle. You see a lot of these companies talk about gaming, not gambling. Is sports betting now more entertainment industry, financial market, and does that depend on who is doing it? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
People might think, these sort of semantic debates are silly or beside the point. The more I spend time with this, the less I feel that way. I feel like it actually tells a lot about how operators think and how they want to position their products, even down to what the heck it is we're doing. Is it gambling or gaming? As I learned, that linguistic strategy goes all the way back to the 1990s when they recognized if you call something gambling, people think of a casino. They recognize you shouldn't spend all your time in a casino. They know people who gamble can get addicted, and that can be ruinous and cause people to lose marriages and even their lives. Whereas gaming sounds innocent and harmless, and nowadays might even bring to mind video games. So the industry really prefers that term. An example of that is after one of the operators, PointsBet, which has since been acquired by Fanatics, got in some trouble for partnering with a handful of colleges to market directly to students. They faced a lot of blowback for that, and there was a senator who demanded that all the operators explain what they're doing to mitigate young people from taking up gambling. And DraftKings sent a letter that I got to read in response to that inquiry, and it listed like 50 references to gaming and not one reference to gambling. The other piece of this I'll mention is when they talk about responsible gaming, how serious could you really be about that concept if you're not even going to call it gambling? I think that profoundly undermines their mission. And then you look at the specifics, and I think you'll feel even more conviction that all the bet responsible stuff and responsible gaming initiatives is window dressing. It's a PR strategy more than it is a serious effort to curtail gambling harm.
Well, and I think it sort of creates the base for what is their marketing strategy, which is the gamification of gambling. So, you get it's not just about placing the bets, it's the points you can acquire, it's the super bets you can unlock. You get more invested each time. And, I've been very honest with this show with Jeff about my own gambling in the past. When you get in debt, you're looking for ways to get out of debt. And if somebody's going to give you a 2 times or 3 times parlay or teaser where you think you have that knowledge and there's a gamification, more of an instant, hit from it, you're going to do it. And so I don't think it's linguistics. I think it really matters.
And we can see the consequences. I've spoken with a number of gambling counselors who help people recover from an addiction. And they say one of the first and biggest hurdles is just getting it through the head of their clients that what they're doing is gambling. Nowadays, people think of sports betting as something different. They think of it as a side hustle, an investing strategy, as monetizing all of the time we spend as sports fans obsessing over games,
For me, it gave me
not
to do
not
socially.
gambling.
Yeah, it gave me
Yeah, yeah.
socially. I could always say I had plans if I had money on the game. And if I knew that I could get more out of that, like I always joke with Jeff that I am glad I quit before it was on my phone. I have
Mm.
no idea the damage I could have done if I didn't have to actually find a bookie to place my bet. And I just could have done it from the convenience of my mobile phone.
It's amazing how what a difference that makes, the ability to bet online, how that was lost on so many lawmakers, and how some of them, I guess to their credit, have owned that. So one example is Charlie Baker, the former governor of Massachusetts, who signed a betting bill shortly before becoming president of the NCAA. And he told me he just didn't connect the dots that the ability to bet in real time anywhere on any hour of the day on anything you're potentially watching or not watching is so different than having to call a bookie, wait in line at a casino. All of these things that provide friction to help you say, am I overdoing it? Or just barriers like people are only going to drive to the casino so often if they can bet on their phone from their couch. It's really hard to restrain yourself. So it's like it's an entirely new product, both the ease of doing it and the number of things you can bet on, and the ease of depositing money and on and on. And yet people thought it was just the same old sports betting that we've had in this country for centuries.
Well, you talked about the difference between gambling and gaming. Now that we have companies like Polymarket, doesn't that just make the gray area even worse?
No question. And from a legal standpoint, they have to argue it's not gambling because they're not regulated as gambling operators. They're regulated as derivatives exchanges by the federal government. The practical ramifications of that is it just reinforces this idea that you could risk money on who's going to win tonight's playoff game, and yet it's something other than gambling because you're doing it on a prediction market. It's even in the categorized in the App Store under the finance section. They've got partnerships now with CNBC and the parent of the Wall Street Journal. There's so much that gives the impression that this is an investing strategy. And as we've been discussing, that's so counterproductive. And I think ultimately, I don't know if they're going to get away with not calling it gambling for long. There's a number of states that have sued to stop that. Arizona brought criminal charges. I think it's destined for the Supreme Court. But for now, at least, it's the latest example of people being very shrewd and finding a loophole. And you'll remember FanDuel and DraftKings got their start and became household names and really had such a head start in the race to cash in on the betting boom because they were daily fantasy operators that said, no, this isn't gambling, this is fantasy sports, even if Now what you were doing on those sites looks a whole lot like prop betting. So this is nothing new, but the fact that there's so many more people looking to gamble than ever before, it might be more dangerous than ever.
I wanted to ask you about the media landscape before we wrap. Just a couple more. Sports books deeply embedded in sports broadcasting. The injury reports getting out through the media that can then get to sports books. The integration during the game that occurs. How does this integration affect journalistic independence and the way games are presented to audiences when you have an ESPN bet as the sponsor of different content?
There are two sides of it. One is promoting gambling in general and specific types of betting that's especially favorable for the house and making it seem like the smart thing to do, or like here's who you should bet tonight, or here's the parlay I'm thinking of betting. All of that gives it doesn't do your audience much good because parlays and a lot of the bets that you hear about in these ads or these promotions give the house a substantially bigger edge. The other side of it that I find even more concerning is the idea that all this advertising has a chilling effect on sports journalists where they're reluctant to say something that might cost them an advertiser that's keeping their company afloat. And I think from a business standpoint, it's hard to argue with that. But from a journalism standpoint, it's really a betrayal of your audience. If you're going to pull punches or bite your tongue about the dangers of gambling, about the threat of match fixing, about the ways these products can be misleading, if you're not going to say that because you don't want to upset a sponsor, that's terrible. And I heard, as I reported in my book, from a number of people at ESPN, at all sorts of sports outlets who said, yes, that really does happen. We really do think that way. There was even one guy, his name's Henry Abbott, who used to work at ESPN. Now he has a newsletter, who said, it's as if sports media is being bribed by all of that advertising. The last quote I'll say on that topic is a guy who was investigating something that would call into question the integrity of officiating in the NBA, which would also be bad for gambling because it rests on the assumption that officiating is legit. And he said, I wonder if I'm committing career suicide by going down this road. The words he used was, I worry I'm tying a noose around my neck just because causing trouble for these gambling companies can be a death sentence for a journalist.
Hmm. Last one. What going forward? Rise of AI, other technology. What do we have to worry about, and what should policymakers, officials, fans be aware of that could mitigate those risks?
Nationwide, I think a big thing to keep your eye on is the spread of online casino gambling, which I know has been legal in New Jersey for a while, but only something like half a dozen states legalize it. And it makes about 10 times as much as sports betting, but unsurprisingly, it's also more dangerous just because it is so easy to get carried away if you're playing blackjack on your commute, or if you're waiting in line somewhere playing roulette. The money just disappears in an instant. So the industry is definitely pushing more states to legalize that. I think they're also going to push micro betting, this form of betting constantly as you're watching a game, which to a lot of people replicates a slot machine, just this frenzied betting on a minute by minute basis. And I remember speaking with someone who is an executive at a company that generates those types of micro bets, this betting on a play by play or pitch by pitch basis. The company was since acquired by DraftKings. And I said, gosh, for one, I could imagine someone who bets like $50 pregame, but is now betting $10 10 times during a game will look up and say, oh man, I just bet twice as much as I intended. And he said, yeah, that's the goal. That's our idea. And the other thing I asked him was, what about this concern that betting in this way is a road to compulsive behavior? And he jumped in and he said, sticky. Sticky is how we like to think of it. It's an especially sticky way of betting. And I think we all know that's kind of a tech euphemism for getting you hooked on a
Yeah.
product. So,
It's another word
uh,
to say addicted.
yeah, for real. So I'd look out for that.
The book is Everybody Loses: The Tumultuous Rise of American Sports Gambling. If you're curious why the lines are in the corner of your screen, what it means, and how it impacts your team in the coverage, give this book a read. Danny Funt, thanks so much for the time.
Hey, thank you guys.